who have lost their jobs because we've not acted on the AGOA bill. And they tend to be single moms, thousands, because they believe they can't get orders to sell in the U.S. I finished, and I'll explain. Yeah. To sell in the U.S. And consequently, jobs in the United States now are in jeopardy because of this bill is not, the AGOA bill has not been extended. Now, it is true that the AGOA bill does not expire to the end of September. That is true. However, as a practical matter, these women have lost their jobs already because American companies are not taking orders from African countries who provide the apparel that would be otherwise provided for in the AGOA bill. So it's a huge issue for those African women who have lost their jobs, as well as a lot of American companies who are in jeopardy because they can't receive the apparel from African countries if this is not extended. I might say, too, the DR-CAFTA bill is similar. That puts in jeopardy a lot of jobs in South Carolina and North Carolina. And so in a certain sense, the jobs bill. Both these bills are important. They're very important. And this package was put together and agreed to by senators on the committee, Republicans and Democrats, both, is agreed to by the leadership's office, both sides. We worked hard, as the leader often does, to get consensus around here. And so this was the thought, put the bills together. All Republicans agreed. There was one senator who said he had a problem with one of the pay-fors. And frankly, it's a pay-for that this body's adopted many times. And that senator himself has voted for this pay-for many times. And it just seems to me that if we break up the package, then the package is broken. It puts in jeopardy those other provisions. Senators will want to offer amendments. And the senator from Kentucky well knows that once we start going down that road, you know, things get hung up around here. The main point being, these are both very important bills. And other main point being, it was agreed to. This package was agreed to all the way around. And I just think at this point, it does not make sense to break it up. So I object.
Mr. President, if I...
The Republican leader.
Yeah. If I may, I believe the Burma sanctions bill has been renewed without additional matters attached to it for some 10 years now on an annual basis. I'm perplexed as to why this year it was turned into a package. I agree with the distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee. It was agreed to. But there is a dispute here between the chairman of the Finance Committee and another member of the Finance Committee who's on the floor, Senator Coburn, who can speak for himself. I might say I don't have a dog in that fight. That's, as far as I'm concerned, another matter. And no matter how important that may be, I doubt if failure to pass the other measure, which doesn't expire until September, creates a major potential foreign policy problem, which could well be created by the Burma sanctions bill expiring later today. So I won't argue that the rest of the bill is important or unimportant. I frankly don't know much about the rest of the bill. I do know something about Burma sanctions, having authored the original bill 10 years ago, having been on the floor as we renewed it annually during that period. And I'm pretty confident that this will be perceived in Burma as a problem. Seems to me it's a completely avoidable problem. As to the rest of it, the senator from Oklahoma is here. He can speak for himself, and I defer to him and to the chairman of the Finance Committee to discuss the balance of the bill. But it would have been my hope, had the chairman of the Finance Committee not objected, it was cleared on my side. It was cleared on my side, regardless of previous understandings about putting the package together, was cleared on my side by the ranking member of the Finance Committee, Senator Hatch, by Senator Coburn, to split the Burma sanctions bill off and pass it freestanding today on a voice vote. So that consent agreement that I offered, which was objected to, I want to make sure everybody understands there were no objections to it on the Republican side of the aisle.
Mr. President.
The objection has been heard to the request of the Republican leader, the senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I do not want to belabor the point here. The administration, the Obama administration, is opposed to splitting the package apart. They're in favor of keeping the package as it is. And I think for good reason, because the administration favors both Burma as well as AGOA, DR-CAFTA. That's the reason. They're both very important. And it's for that reason I just think it makes sense. You're right. It's very easy to resolve this thing. It's just to proceed with Burma and AGOA. But if the leader wants to keep talking about, I'm more than willing over the next week to see if there's some other resolution we can work out here. But I just, you know.
Can I just ask
Sure.
the Chairman a question? So
The Republican leader.
Just asking a question. So what I hear is the Democratic administration and Democratic senators are opposed to passing the Burma sanctions bill today freestanding. Is that what I hear the Chairman
No,
ask about?
that's not what you heard. Well, you heard me say.
Well, then why did you object to the consent?
Because the administration and myself want them both.
But you can't get them both today unless you can work this problem out with my good friend from Oklahoma, who is on the floor and may wish to address this matter.
And as I said, I'm more than willing to sit down and try to work it out. But at this point, I think that any attempt to split out is going to jeopardize a very important bill here, and that's the AGOA bill. And as I mentioned earlier, there are already thousands of women who lost their jobs in Africa because of our delay on passing AGOA.
The Republican leader.
Yeah, let me just make sure we understand where we are. The consent agreement to pass the Burma sanctions bill today before it expires is clear on this side of the aisle. Clear. The chairman of the Finance Committee has announced, to my surprise, that the administration does not favor allowing Burma sanctions to pass today because it is attached to something related to other matters. So make no mistake about it, we have, for the first time in the history of this issue, turned it into a partisan matter. We have spoken with one voice in America related to Burma under administrations of both parties, senates of both parties, and today, for the first time, we have a partisan split over an issue about which America ought to be speaking with one voice. So I've basically said all I have to say here. I do want to hear from Senator Coburn. I know he has strong feelings about the other parts of the measure with which I am basically not familiar.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
First of all, I'd like to say that I support all three of these measures in terms of passing them. What I don't support is continuing the habit that put this country $16 trillion in debt. And to clarify, as a member of the Finance Committee, if you read my opening statement in that hearing, in that markup, I objected to this bill on the basis of pay-fors. I offered two separate amendments that, on the floor, everybody would agree are germane because the money to pay for the $200 million comes out of trade areas. And they were rejected as non-germane by the chairman. So they weren't offered because he said he would reject them. So to create the impression that there was no objection to the pay-for in this bill and that everybody agreed is inaccurate, to say the least. I called Chris Coons, who's interested in this. I've called Senator Coons from Delaware. I called Senator Baucus when this came up, told him I have a plan so we can get this all done this week. I was willing to lose a vote on the amendment, but have an opportunity to offer the amendment and give my side of the story by splitting these two so that the House could pass it. The House has now gone home. Burma sanctions are no longer available to be passed except if we were to do something extraordinary with the House, which I understand from the Speaker can happen. So Burma sanctions could happen this week. But I want to go back to the more important point. Whether I've voted for something in the past or not, using the type of pay-for that is in this bill, which is what I call the wimpy mechanism. Wimpy drives up to Wendy's and orders a hamburger, and when he gets around to the pay-for window, says, don't worry about it, I'll be back in 10 days to pay for it. And so what we've done is we've used custom user fees over 10 years to collect enough money to pay for $200 million. Well, with the waste that's in this government, for us to use a 10-year pay-for something that's going to be expended over 3 years means that we're not capable of addressing the very much bigger issues in front of our country. And if we can't even find $200 million in a $3.6 trillion budget, we are unqualified to be here. So what I would say is to my friend and my colleague on the Senate Finance Committee, somebody has to start saying no. And I will remind you of a lecture I got from Senator Pete Domenici on a land bill about 2 years ago. He said, we've always done it that way. And I said, you know what? You're right. And that's why we're in trouble. So the financing mechanism on this bill denies the situation that we're in and charges out over 10 years custom user fees to pay for it. No other American business, no other company, no other family gets that kind of luxury at all, especially when they're in debt at 105% of their GDP. And if you really look at where we are, the average American, what you can say is that really you're taking in $53,000, you're spending $73,000, and what you actually owe is $380,000. And we can't keep doing that, because that's how it would relate to the individual family in this country. And so the objection was not on the bills. There was no lack of effort on my part to reach out and solve this problem before now. And now the minority leader offers a way to solve the problem on the sanctions for Burma, and it's objected to. So not only do we not get to offer amendments in committee, we do not get to offer amendments on the floor, and one of the things that we need to accomplish today, we're not going to do because we don't want to allow amendments. Because we want to keep doing it the way we've always done it. And the way we always have done it has bankrupted our country and stolen from our grandchildren and children. It's not acceptable anymore. That's the truth. Everything else is the game that Washington plays. And I will tell my colleagues I'm still willing to work on this. I have a commitment to the senator from Delaware that next week, if this comes up, I'll be the first to offer that amendment and get it out of the way and take a very short period of time of the Senate. But I want a recorded vote of the senators in this body that they want to steal from custom user fees for 10 years for just a $200 million pay-for. If that's really what you want to do, then vote that way, but go out and defend it. Instead of taking something this administration has recommended we cut, which is what I'm using to pay for it, something this administration has recommended to pay for it, and vote against what your own president says, here's something we need to eliminate. I don't get it. The American people don't get it. No wonder we have a 9% approval rating. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I appreciate the opportunity to briefly contribute what I can to this debate. One of the great honors, as you know, Mr. President, of being a freshman is the opportunity to preside. And I had the opportunity to preside when the Republican leader came to the floor and spoke to Burma sanctions. And so I just wanted to say to the Republican leader that because of that speech, I familiarized myself with the issue of Burma sanctions that he spoke to earlier. I do think it's important that we move to it. I do think it's important to move forward on it. But the Republican leader made a comment earlier that he doesn't much understand the other part of the bill, which is AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. I choose to stand briefly to speak to that, if I might, because I am the chair of the African Affairs Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Isaacson and I joined with Congresswoman Bass and Congressman Smith in twice receiving dozens of ambassadors from across the continent 3 months ago and 9 months ago as they expressed their grave concern about the thousands of mostly women all across the continent who are losing their jobs as we delay. The AGOA reauthorization expires in September, and I am grateful to Chairman Baucus for his vigorous pursuit of renewal in a timely fashion. AGOA needs to be renewed promptly, not in September. And part, I believe, of why the administration has insisted on holding together Burma sanctions and this AGOA reauthorization is because of the urgency of getting AGOA reauthorized. It dates back to the Clinton administration. It was first signed into law a dozen years ago. It has, I think, real importance for our view in Africa, for how the United States is viewed in Africa, for our bilateral relations with more than a dozen countries, I would be happy to answer questions about it. But we have three different issues here. The concerns that the senator from Oklahoma has raised about the pay-for, and I respect his concerns about budget and budgetary discipline and dealing with our deficit. The concerns the Republican leader has raised about Burma and about sanctions and about our ongoing role as a global leader in pressing for the liberation of people and process in Burma, and the concerns that I and many other senators have shared about timely reauthorization of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Unfortunately, the three of them intersect in a way that today is preventing us from moving forward. It is my hope that the Republican leader, the chairman of the Finance Committee, the senator from Oklahoma, and I could sit down and craft some responsible compromise that allows this to move forward. Because if my understanding is correct, it is the senator from Oklahoma's concerns that are preventing us from moving forward at this point, and it is the administration's concerns that are preventing breaking apart the Burma sanctions and AGOA sanctions, and there is a third provision relating to CAFTA, if I'm not mistaken. And so if we could but work together in a way that finds a responsible path forward, it is still, I think, possible. There is bipartisan support in the House for the passage of this package. In fact, I believe they were prepared to pass it by unanimous consent earlier this week and only hesitated to proceed because they'd heard there was a hold here in the Senate. I'd like to work together in a way that can demonstrate to the people of Burma, to the people of Africa, to the people around the world, that this greatest deliberative body on earth can still work out issues of this scale in a timely fashion. And so I offer my willingness to work together to find a path forward, either tonight or in the week ahead. Thank you. I yield the floor.
Senator from Montana.
I don't mean to belabor the issue. I see that the Republican leaders left the floor. Just a couple of points. One, I don't want the impression to be left here that this is a partisan matter. I don't want the impression to be left here that one party favors Burma sanctions and another doesn't. Same with respect to AGOA provisions. I think the fact is these are both totally bipartisan. Both political parties favor these measures, and it's just a matter of working out the way to pass them. And the senator from Delaware made a very good point, says let's see if we can work things out next day, next couple, 3 days. The senator from Oklahoma makes a very valid point, too. That is, sometimes we pay for measures around here, but with measures it takes several years to actually pay for. It's a common practice around here. And to say we've done it once does not necessarily mean it's right. But I say to my good friend from Oklahoma, who has voted for this kind of measure 11 times by my count, and once even on a Burma bill, that when we work the next several weeks, next several months on resolving the fiscal cliff and tax reform, it's a good opportunity to find ways to reduce our budget deficits, both spending and revenue, an opportunity to address them in a way that does not do violence to them, or to respects the concept that the senator from Oklahoma was mentioning. He's mentioned a concept which applies not just with respect to customs user fees, but for a lot of tax provisions around here. And I think it's something we should talk about and figure out, how we want to handle it. But in the meantime, I just suggest that let's keep talking. There's a few days left here before we leave for the August recess, and just thank my colleagues for working together to try to find a solution here. I yield the floor.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, tomorrow the attention of the world will turn to London as we witness the opening of the 2012 Summer Olympics. Over 10,000 athletes representing 204 nations from around the world will be competing in hundreds of sporting events at the Games of the 30th Olympiad. Here in the United States, we'll be cheering on the 529 U.S. athletes as they look to bring home the gold for the United States of America. The Olympics, no doubt, will have countless stories of triumph and disappointment, competition and camaraderie. I rise today to share the remarkable story of one particular athlete who will be competing this year. His story is one of inspiring triumph of character and spirit. But until just days ago, this Olympian had no flag to compete under. This story is about a talented young runner named Gor Marial, whose mere survival in southern Sudan defied the odds. Having escaped the bloodshed and violence in war-torn Sudan, Gor found his way to my home state of New Hampshire as a teenage refugee. Mr. President, who could have imagined that in just over a decade, Gor would be applying for U.S. citizenship and traveling to London to compete in the Olympic marathon? Gor was born in a town in what is now part of the fledgling country of South Sudan. Many of his family and friends, including his brother, were killed at the hands of Sudanese security forces. Many more died of starvation or disease brought on by the violence and unspeakable crimes committed by these Sudanese forces. Before escaping Sudan, Gor was a victim of violence on numerous occasions. As a child, he was kidnapped from his hometown and enslaved as a laborer before eventually finding a way to escape and return to his family. Gor was severely beaten by the Sudanese police, had to spend days in a hospital to recover. Finally, he was able to flee to neighboring Egypt and eventually to the peace and safety of New Hampshire as a refugee seeking asylum. Gor arrived in my home state of New Hampshire in 2001, almost exactly 11 years ago. He remembers that day well and still considers New Hampshire his home. He lived in Concord, the state capital, moving in with the families of his friends, teammates, and his cross-country coach for 2 years in order to graduate from high school. The contrast between Gor's former life and his new life is stark. In Sudan, he was running in fear for his life. In New Hampshire, he was running for the joy of athletic competition and to be part of a team. Amazingly, in only his second official marathon, Gor ran fast enough to qualify for the 2012 London Olympics. Given his unique situation, however, it looked like the bureaucracy would triumph over his bravery, that Gor might not be able to compete. Because according to the rules of the International Olympic Committee, permanent residents of a country are not permitted to compete on that country's team. As a result, Gor can't compete under the American flag because he's not yet a full citizen. In addition, Gor can't run for the newly recognized country of South Sudan because it's such a new country, it doesn't yet have an official Olympic committee. The International Olympic Committee suggested that Gor compete as a member of the Sudanese team, and the Sudanese government extended him an invitation. But Gor rightfully refused, explaining that running for Sudan, and I quote here, would be a disappointment and an embarrassment to me and the people of South Sudan who died for freedom, including my brother, end quote. Gor was not comfortable running on behalf of the country that tortured and murdered so many of his family members. That solution would have been cruel and unacceptable. Fortunately, after some pressure by Refugees International and other friends of Gor who wrote to the International Olympic Committee on his behalf, we received the great news this week that the IOC Executive Board has decided to make an exception for Gor. He will run in the marathon as an independent Olympic athlete under the great Olympic flag. I want to thank the International Olympic Committee for this very appropriate ruling. In addition, I want to thank the U.S. Olympic Committee, the U.S. Department of State, and the other friends of Gor who worked so hard to make his participation possible. As he runs under that five-ringed flag, long a symbol of hope for peace in our world, Gor will run with the support of his family, his New Hampshire supporters, Americans everywhere, and his new country, South Sudan. I have a feeling that such support might help him run even faster. We're so proud of Gor in New Hampshire and proud that in the United States, someone who's lived through such tragedy and adversity can start a new life and rise to such incredible heights. Scott Hamilton, an American Olympic gold medalist, once said, "Most other competitions are individual competitions, but the Olympic Games is something that belongs to everybody." No matter the outcome in London, the story of Gor Mariel and the adversity he has overcome belongs to everyone. Win or lose, he will stand as a lasting inspiration for people around the globe and as a tribute to the greatness that is the United States of America. I look forward to welcoming Gor home from the Olympics as a winner, regardless of the outcome of the marathon. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm here tonight on a different topic than the Senator from New Hampshire, but want to congratulate you on your fine work here. I know you don't need me to say that, or you wouldn't want me to say that, but the people of New Hampshire are so lucky to be represented by you, and this is exactly why. A reminder that our Olympic athletes are about to start, I hope, winning gold medals. I suspect they will win the most in this Summer Olympics. We're looking forward to that. You mentioned marathons, and it brought to mind what I wanted to talk about tonight, which is the Farm Bill. How's that for an elegant segue from one marathon to another? I want to talk about it in the context of the severe drought that's facing Colorado and all of rural America. And I want to acknowledge the administration's ongoing efforts to provide Coloradans with disaster relief during this difficult summer of fires and drought. Mr. President, we need to pass a 5-year Farm Bill as quickly as possible to address the challenges that we're seeing in farm country. And we've done the work to get an agreement on the Senate bill. In fact, we've passed a 5-year Farm Bill in this Senate. It was a strong bipartisan bill. I want to thank the chairwoman, Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, the ranking member of the committee, for their incredible leadership, working together with both sides of the aisle, never in a partisan way, to produce, among other things, the only bipartisan deficit reduction that any committee, House or Senate, has produced in this United States Congress. $24 billion of deficit reduction that's been agreed to by Republicans and Democrats. It ends direct payments to producers, which is one of the most substantial reforms that we've seen in agriculture policy in a long time, and it strengthens the conservation title of the Farm Bill, which is very important to my state and to the West. Mr. President, Colorado has a $40 billion agriculture sector that extends to all corners of our state. Farming and ranching are two things that we do extremely well. The senator from Iowa is here tonight, and I know he knows that his farmers do it extremely well in Iowa as well. But producers in Colorado and nationwide are experiencing the worst drought in 50 years. While Colorado is certainly no stranger to water challenges, this year's growing season has been particularly tough, to put it mildly. According to the U.S. Drought Monitor, nearly our entire state is designated as an extreme drought area. This designation means that we are experiencing major damage to crops and pasture land, as well as widespread water shortages. While this designation tells us a lot, we really only need to ask the farmers and ranchers about how dry the conditions are threatening their operations. I met recently with a group of corn growers from eastern Colorado. Take a look, Mr. President, at what these farmers are up against. This is Steve Scott's cornfield 18 miles southeast of Burlington, Colorado, a town of 4,200 people near the Kansas border. This crop and many others in the entire region have withered under long stretches of high temperatures with little or no precipitation to help. The Department of Agriculture reports that 50% of Colorado's corn production is in either poor or very poor condition. The drought has also taken a significant toll on our cattle producers. Colorado is one of America's top beef producers. Right now, 75% of pasture land in Colorado, approximately 900,000 acres. I'm not sure how that measures up to the presiding officer's state, but it's probably getting pretty close to that size, is rated as either poor or very poor in condition. Dry pasture and feed shortages have led ranchers to liquidate their herds early, well before they've realized their full size and value. The Greeley, Colorado Producers Auction Barn is seeing double the sales activity right now as compared to the same time last year. Because ranchers are selling their cattle below full weight and maturity, they're losing anywhere from $200 to $400 a head. Next week, Carl Hansen of Livermore, Colorado, is selling 160 of his steers and 90 heifers. On average, each animal will be sold 150 pounds underweight due to the drought conditions. And if beef is selling at $1.50 a pound, that's $56,000, a little more than that. $56,000 of lost revenue for Carl Hansen and his family. And the consequences of this drought extend well beyond farm country, Mr. President. The damage to our farms and ranches affect other sectors of the economy, from transportation to energy to banking to retail. Mr. President, I know, we all know, there's nothing Congress can do to stop the drought or protect the next one from coming. But what we can do is give our farmers and ranchers the tools they need to manage this drought and plan for the future by passing a 5-year farm bill. You hear a lot about uncertainty in these two chambers. I can't imagine a set of circumstances creating more uncertainty in a more difficult situation than this. And now we hear that the House leadership is planning a 1-year punt on this whole conversation. One more expression that Washington, D.C. has become the land of flickering lights, providing very little opportunity for people to be able to plan and have predictability. I ask what's wrong with the Senate-passed bipartisan farm bill that had the support of 64 senators. 64 senators, Democrats and Republicans. Some people voted against it because they didn't think it was adequate to their region, but this was not a partisan vote. Neither majority vote nor the minority vote was a partisan vote. This was the Senate operating as the Senate is meant to do. A 5-year bill provides our agricultural community with much-needed certainty and predictability, but now it's being held up in the House by politics. And let's be clear, no one, I'm saying it again, no one is pretending that the Farm Bill can correct bad weather. And our producers certainly aren't waiting on the Farm Bill to keep doing what they do best. Colorado will continue innovating and increasing productivity. But the last thing on earth they need right now, the last thing on earth they need is to have Washington's unfinished business hanging around their necks. A 5-year farm bill will provide producers with a set of tools for managing through this drought and planning for the future. The 1-year bill being discussed over in the House by the leadership doesn't recognize or is unwilling to recognize the agricultural community's need to do long-term planning. Among many other important provisions, the Senate Farm Bill contains revamped risk management programs like crop insurance, which is what I heard was needed by our farmers. Improvements farmers requested to help manage a severe drought, exactly like the one we're going through right now. This is the point of that provision. A 1-year bill doesn't have any of those improvements. Corn farmers on Colorado's eastern plains could lose 40% or more of their revenue this season. We need these reforms and the predictability of the Senate bill. Our bill also contains permanent disaster programs that provide responsible assistance to producers in need. Some of these programs, such as the livestock disaster programs, expired in September 2011, almost a year ago. If Congress takes the easy way out and does a 1-year extension, our livestock producers will get no relief. None. This means no disaster assistance for ranchers whose pasture is too dry to feed their cattle. Who's going to explain to the people selling at the Greeley auction barn why this isn't a priority for our Congress in the middle of the worst drought in decades? The House Ag Committee passed a 5-year farm bill with a strong bipartisan 35-11 vote. Again, this is not the partisan dysfunctionality that we've talked about so many months on this floor. We have two bipartisan bills. One is passed out of committee on the House side with broad bipartisan support. One passed right here on the Senate floor with broad bipartisan support. And so it's not surprising that I'm not the only person that's calling for long-term extension, a 5-year extension. 79 House members, including 41 Republicans, wrote the Speaker last week asking him to bring the long-term farm bill to the floor. And I'd like to enter that letter into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. They wrote, "The message from our constituents in rural America is clear. We need a farm bill now. We ask that you bring a farm bill up during the August district work period." They went on to say, quote, "We ask that you make this legislation a priority of the House, as it is critically important to rural and urban Americans alike." Representative Rick Berg, a Republican from North Dakota, took to the floor last week and said, quote, "Now is the time for the House to act. The time for a farm bill is now." Joanne Emerson, a Republican congresswoman from Missouri, told reporters that, quote, "There are problems with my farmers who need to make planning decisions." We're seeing that exact same uncertainty plaguing our farmers and ranchers in Colorado, yet here we are again. We've seen this before in Washington. We're pretty good at starting conversations, but we're not very good at finishing them, kicking the can down the road once again. But this is the Farm Bill. This is the Farm Bill, a bipartisan effort that rarely, if ever, has been used as a political football around this place. 3 days ago, David Rogers wrote an article which I think accurately describes our dilemma. It was in Politico, and I'd ask that this article also be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. To quote Mr. Rogers, quote, "Never before in modern times has a farm bill reported from the House Agriculture Committee been so blocked." Never before in modern times. I suspect it's true in ancient times as well, but it's certainly been true in modern times. Rogers tells us that he, quote, "looked back at 50 years of farm bills, 50 years, a half century, and found nothing like this." He continues, "Farmers live by nature's calendar, not continuing resolutions." I could never have said it so eloquently myself. Quote, "And by failing to act, Congress can seem even more detached from the real lives of everyday people." I would not have thought it was possible that this place could seem more detached from the everyday lives of the American people than it already appears to be. But we found a way of doing that, and that's by failing to pass this bipartisan farm bill through the United States Congress in a timely way that's essential for people that are suffering through this kind of drought. I think Mr. Rogers' observation is exactly right, and that's, I've been on this floor many times before saying that the people at home in Colorado, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, don't identify with the cartoon of a conversation that we're having in Washington, D.C. right now. And I can't think of a clearer example than the failure to act on this bipartisan piece of legislation that would immediately help people all across our country, all across America, who are struggling today. Mr. President, think for just a moment about our farmers in Colorado and rural communities just like our communities all across this wonderful country. Our farmers and ranchers are experiencing the worst drought in over half a century. Who's going to look in the eyes of our farmers in Middle America and tell them that our dysfunctional politics will prevent this bill from moving forward? Who's going to tell Steve Scott and Carl Hansen that this bill just isn't going to be a priority in the Congress, that we're just going to take our recess and go home for a month not having passed this bipartisan piece of legislation, the only manifestation, the only example of bipartisan deficit reduction in either the House or the Senate in this entire Congress? Mr. President, I implore the House to figure out how to come to its senses and pass a 5-year bill along the lines of the bill that was passed out of their committee, and then together we can have a conference and decide how we're going to move this bill forward on behalf of farmers and ranchers all across my state and all across the United States of America. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
I didn't come to the floor to speak about the farm bill because I did that yesterday, but I want to assure the senator from Colorado I listened to everything he said and I agree with him, and that was my plea, maybe in a little broader context yesterday, asking that the House of Representatives take up the bill. And I also said about the same time, being that the House brags legitimately so about being fiscally conservative, and so I agree with what the senator from Colorado said about this may be the only opportunity and presumably will be the only opportunity to pass a farm bill or any bill that saves money from previous programs of previous years. So I compliment the senator from Colorado. Mr. President, I come to the floor to discuss what I consider a disturbing trend that is occurring in this country. A vicious attack is underway on the right to freedom of speech that is protected by the First Amendment. It needs to be highlighted and hopefully will stop. Free speech is one of the most important rights that Americans enjoy. Speech on public issues is the way that democracy discusses and debates the important questions of the day. Many great political movements in this country's history depended upon this right, this First Amendment right, freedom of speech. Even when Martin Luther King was jailed and his supporters subjected to violence, free speech enabled him to change the views and practices of an entire nation. But today, too many government officials seek to shut up people who disagree with them rather than debate those people and debate those issues. There have been a series of recent incidents that I want to refer to. Consider recently in the Senate Committee on the Judiciary, just in the past month, the committee has held 2 hearings that prove my point. A hearing was held on a bill that would criminalize supposedly deceptive statements in advance of elections. It would allow government to criminalize political speech based on its content. It would risk government selectively choosing to prosecute its political opponents. It would allow political candidates to make criminal accusations against their opponents. So, it would chill candidates from speaking. A few days after our hearing, the Supreme Court's ruling in the Alvarez case confirmed all the free speech problems with that bill. But even after that decision, the Justice Department, to my disappointment, issued a letter in support of the bill. That letter made no mention of any First Amendment considerations. I have heard no indication that the committee will not mark up this bill, which represents a grave threat to freedom of speech. This week, the Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on the Constitution held a hearing on legislative responses to the Citizens United case. In that decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment free speech guarantee protects the rights of corporations and unions to make independent expenditures in support of candidates or on any particular policy issue that they want to speak out on. The ruling has no effect on campaign contributions. There are proposals in this body to amend the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, for the very first time, to allow the government to limit how much candidates could spend on speech and therefore the amount of speech that the government will permit. And there are proposed constitutional amendments to prevent corporations and labor unions from spending in elections. To me, this is very serious business that we ought to be raising a red flag about. It is worth remembering what rule the Obama administration asked the Supreme Court to adopt in Citizens United. The Justice Department argued that the government should be able to ban books that contained even one sentence that expressly advocated the election or defeat of a candidate if those books were published or distributed by a corporation or a union. This administration argued in favor of banning books. In light of the practice of totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, this administration's position on free speech is very astonishing. The Supreme Court quite rightly rejected the argument of the administration on that particular point. It reminded the news media, which is organized in corporate form for the most part, that the exemption from campaign finance laws is by statute and which is one that Congress could remove at any time, threatening freedom of press. If that were to happen and the Constitution were to read to allow restrictions on corporate independent expenditures, the guarantee of freedom of the press would it be as threatened as the freedom of free speech. Then there is another situation, and this deals with the restaurant chain of Chick-fil-A. The owner of that chain is a Christian who has spoken in favor of the value of traditional marriage. The chain has not discriminated against anyone so far as has been reported. The restaurant seeks to expand in Boston and Chicago, where presumably it would create new jobs. And it must, in order to get there, it has to meet the permit requirements. However, Mayor Menino of Boston wrote a letter to the company president. He said that because of the owner's quote-unquote prejudice statements, that there would be no place in Boston for the discrimination the company represented. The mayor notified the property owners where the restaurant wished to open of his views. In Chicago, an alderman seeks to deny Chick-fil-A from opening in his ward for the same reason. It is reported that the President Obama's former chief of staff, now Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, is sympathetic to the alderman's point of view. So once again, this is a gross violation of First Amendment free speech. Government cannot deny a benefit to someone because it disagrees with the applicant's views. This is the fundamental principle of our constitutional democracy. Voicing support for traditional marriage is not discrimination. That speech is not hate speech. Even if it were, the First Amendment protects speech that is unpopular with the government. There is no constitutional speech code that allows banning a hate speech any more than government can ban speech in books. Finally, the Alvarez decision a few weeks ago affects another First Amendment issue pending before this body right now. The Alvarez case, in that case, the Supreme Court struck down the Stolen Valor Act, which criminalizes lies concerning winning military medals. It did so on free speech ground. I know that many of my colleagues desire to pass a new law that will accomplish that goal, and if that law is constitutional, I'll probably join them in that effort. Two bills on this subject are now pending in the Senate. Senator Brown of Massachusetts introduced the first bill, and then Senator Webb did so after the Alvarez decision. There have been efforts to pass both bills by voice vote. When the Republicans were asked to move the Webb bill, we were told that all Democrats supported the bill. This is a problem. The Webb bill is clearly unconstitutional based upon the Alvarez decision. It criminalizes some lies about medals that the Supreme Court says Congress cannot criminalize. For instance, it would prohibit lies in campaigns and in employment, even when those lies would not produce the tangible material benefit that is necessary to punish them. Yet no Democrat objected to to passing the bill without debate. Of course, Republicans could not agree to such a request. Since he did not have the benefit of the Supreme Court decision when he wrote the bill that Senator Brown put in, right now, because of the decision, and he didn't know about it, Senator Brown's bill is also unconstitutional. The difference between his bill and Senator Webb's bill, however, is that Senator Brown now has a substitute amendment that seems to address the problem in a fully constitutional way. But although Democrats want to pass without debate a clearly unconstitutional bill, somehow they object to a clearly constitutional Brown bill. These games should stop. I'm sure that all the members of this body should be willing to support a single constitutional bill that would reenact the prohibition of lying about whether or not you're entitled to certain military medals. In short, this country is facing a disturbing increase in government actions that violate the freedom of speech. That is a vital right of our democracy. Anyone can stand up for speech with which they agree. The test for government officials and the test for free speech is whether they will allow speech with which they might disagree. They may criticize speech, debate the speech, and seek to change minds. But shutting people up, denying them benefits, passing bills that would put people in jail for exercising free speech rights, these are never allowable under our Constitution. It's time for elected officials to pay greater heed to the oath to support the Constitution. Recently, former FBI Director William Webster was asked to investigate how the FBI performed about the attack at Fort Hood by Major Hassan. Major Hassan's attack killed 12 U.S. soldiers, a Defense Department employee, and wounded 42 others. Following the attack, the FBI conducted an internal review and determined that it had information on Major Hassan prior to that attack. As a result, the FBI director asked Judge Webster to conduct an independent review and investigation of the FBI's handling of the matter. In short, Judge Webster's commission found that the FBI made mistakes that resulted from a number of problems, some operational, some technological. Some of these mistakes are extremely concerning given that they are basic management failures. For example, the unclassified report states, quote, "Many agents and most task force officers did not receive training on FBI computer systems and other FBI databases until after the FBI's internal investigation of the Fort Hood shootings," end of quote. This is clearly unacceptable. Other problems highlighted include failing to issue intelligence information reports on Major Hassan to the Defense Department, confusion about which FBI office was investigating the lead, failure to interview Major Hassan, along with information technological limitations. All in all, the Webster report paints a disturbing picture of the FBI. It shows lack of training, failure to follow leads, and continued computer problems. These are the types of problems that, quite frankly, we thought were corrected following the terrorist attacks 9/11. Ultimately, Judge Webster issued 18 recommendations for the FBI to implement to prevent future problems like these. The FBI agreed that with these recommendations and has stated that they'll take action to implement those recommendations. That's good news, of course. The FBI must implement these recommendations and do it immediately. However, we have a duty to make sure that the FBI implements these recommendations and hold people accountable, and in fact hold the FBI accountable if they don't. The FBI's failure in this case is inexcusable and shake public confidence in the FBI's ability to combat homegrown terrorism. Basic management problems and investigative failures can happen, particularly if national security is at stake. If failures of this magnitude occur on high-profile national security cases, it makes you wonder what the FBI is doing on other investigations. Those responsible for these failures should be held accountable. I intend to follow up with Director Mueller to determine what action was taken taken against those people that didn't do the job in the right and correct way. One more report that can't go ignored is a report just released this morning by the Justice Department Office of Inspector General. This report examined improper hiring practices within the Justice Department Justice Management Division. Shockingly, the Inspector General found that the Justice Department employees openly and flagrantly violated federal law. Let me repeat that these employees violated federal law and the Department of Justice regulations prohibiting employment of relatives, granting illegal preferences in employment, conflict of interest, and misuse of position. Further, employees who were interviewed by the Office of Inspector General were also found to have made false statements to investigators. This is an example of the Justice Department run wild. It is troubling to me how employees within the departments concluded and schemed to hire one another's relatives in order to avoid rules against nepotism. It's inexcusable, and I can assure you that we'll be looking into this matter. This wasn't a one-time event, by the way. In fact, the Office of Inspector General pointed out that similar problems existed in 2008. Despite what the department called, quote-unquote, aggressive action to stop this type of behavior back in 2008, it appears that nothing has changed. At the very least, the Attorney General needs to hold these employees accountable with more than just disciplinary action. Laws were broken and false statements were made. The department can't simply sweep this under the rug. Employees need to be punished because in this town, if heads don't roll, nothing changes. I yield the floor. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rono.
Mr. President, I return to the floor today to give voice once again to the issue that I feel will most significantly define this generation of leadership in the United States and around the globe. I rise to discuss the notable, evident changes taking place in our Earth's climate, the relationship between our own activities and the change and the rate of change being observed, and our so far forsaken responsibility to address climate change head-on and with purpose. Last month, representatives from world governments, the private sector, NGOs, and other major stakeholders gathered in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. Marking the 20th anniversary of the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, this year's conference was nicknamed Rio Plus 20. Mr. President, so-called sustainable development principles consist of a set of principles and strategies that, when acted upon by the global community, will balance strong economic growth, expansion of just civic and government structures, and environmental protection. Another way to view sustainable development is in the balance of the needs of the present with those of future generations through the fair use of resources. As Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton said, in the 21st century, the only viable development is sustainable development. The only way to deliver lasting progress for everyone is by preserving our resources and protecting our common environment. One positive aspect of this Rio +20 conference was its discussion of the power of economic forces in promoting sustainability. The official outcome document adopted by the conference participants, entitled The Future We Want, highlights the role of private companies, the private sector, and their close collaboration with governments in driving sustainable development. It reads in part, "We acknowledge that the implementation of sustainable development will depend on active engagement of both the public and private sectors. We recognize that the active participation of the private sector can contribute to the achievement of sustainable development, including through the important tool of public-private partnerships." A number of Rio +20's corporate participants have stepped forward to accept this challenge. Many of these global businesses are recognizing that greening their operations is not just good for the environment, it's good for their business as well. Dell, for example, has committed to reducing its worldwide facilities' greenhouse gas emissions 40% by 2015. Dell is a computer technology corporation based in Texas that ranks 44th on the Fortune 500 and employs over 106,000 people. I doubt they made that decision rashly. Bank of America, based in Charlotte, North Carolina, is number 13 on the 2012 Fortune 500 list and was the first bank to offer coast-to-coast operations in the United States. They have committed $50 billion over 10 years to finance energy efficiency, renewable energy, and energy access, and other activities that advance the low-carbon economy. Marriott has displayed both internal and external efforts by committing to build 10 Fairfield by Marriott hotels constructed to sustainable building standards, as well pledging $500,000 to help preserve 1.4 million acres of rainforest in the Juma Reserve in the state of Amazonas, Brazil. Marriott ranks first on the Fortune 500 list in the category of hotel, casinos, resorts. Microsoft has committed to going completely carbon neutral and will be factoring the costs of carbon output into the company's business operations in over 100 countries. These companies are just a few examples from the effort that is being undertaken in the private sector to meet our responsibilities to address climate change. As leaders in government, we must recognize that the private sector will not, however, be able to halt climate change on its own. But these commitments do signify that action on climate change does not need to come at the expense of economic growth. Governments can and must provide incentives for sustainable production and consumption. Indeed, the Rio +20 outcome document goes on to say, we support national regulatory and policy frameworks that enable business and industry to advance sustainable development initiatives, taking into account the importance of corporate social responsibility. As leaders in the public sector, we have the capacity to establish those effective incentives that can leverage billions in private sector investment into sustainable products and services that support environmental and social improvements. The constructive role that government can play is being recognized not just in capitals around the world, but in boardrooms around the world. Yet, unfortunately, here in Washington, the special interests that deny that carbon pollution causes global temperatures to rise, that deny that melting ice caps destabilize our climate so that, for instance, regions face extreme drought, as the senator from Colorado discussed earlier, or outsized precipitation events, as we've seen in my home state of Rhode Island, Those special interests in Washington, they still have a strong hold, and they pretend that the jury is still out on climate changes caused by carbon pollution. This is, to be perfectly blunt about it, an outright falsehood. The fact that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere absorbs heat from the sun was discovered at the time of the Civil War, 1863. 1863 was when the Irish scientist John Tyndall determined that carbon dioxide and also water vapor trapped more heat in the atmosphere as their concentrations increased. The 1955 textbook, Our Astonishing Atmosphere, from the year I was born, notes that nearly a century ago, in 1955, nearly a century ago, the scientist John Tyndall suggested that a fall in the atmospheric carbon dioxide could allow the Earth to cool, whereas a rise in carbon dioxide would make it warmer. So this is not something new. This is not something unusual or extraordinary. This is solidly established science. In the early 1900s, it became clear that changes in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can account for significant increases and decreases in the Earth's annual average temperatures, and that carbon dioxide released primarily by the burning of coal would contribute to these changes. Again, this is not new stuff. These are well-established scientific principles. Let's look at the changes that we observe in our changing planet. Over the last 800,000 years until very recently, the atmosphere has stayed within a bandwidth of 170 to 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide. 170 to 300 parts per million. That's been the range for 8,000 centuries. And by the way, that's a measurement, not a theory. Scientists measure historic carbon dioxide concentrations by locating trapped air bubbles in the ice of ancient glaciers. So we know by measurement over time what the range has been of our carbon dioxide concentration. What else do we know? Well, we know since the Industrial Revolution we've burned carbon-rich fuels in measurable and ever-increasing amounts, and that we are now up to 7 to 8 gigatons each year. A gigaton, by the way, is a billion with a B, a billion metric tons each year into our atmosphere. Releasing all this carbon into the atmosphere has predictably increased the carbon concentration in our atmosphere. That should not be a difficult proposition, that when you're dumping 7 to 8 billion metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year, it raises the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. And we now measure those carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. We measure them climbing. Again, this is a measurement, not a theory. The present concentration exceeds 390 parts per million. 8,000 centuries between 170 and 300 parts per million, and now we're out of that range as far as 390 parts per million. In the Arctic, we have actually clipped over into 400 parts per million. Here's what the Christian Science Monitor said about this. The Arctic is the leading indicator in global warming, both in carbon dioxide in the air and effects, said Peter Tans, a senior NOAA scientist. The Arctic is our leading indicator in global warming, both in terms of the carbon dioxide concentration in the air and the effects of that carbon dioxide concentration. Quote, "This is the first time the entire Arctic is that high," he said, close quote. Tans called reaching the 400 number depressing. And his colleague Jim Butler, who is the Global Monitoring Director at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Earth System Research Lab in Boulder, Colorado, said it was, quote, "a troubling milestone." It's an important threshold, said Carnegie Institution ecologist Chris Field, a scientist who helps lead the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is an indication that we are in a different world. It is an indication that we are in a different world. And in this article, they make the same point that I made a moment ago. I'll quote the article. It's been at least 800,000 years, probably more, since Earth saw carbon dioxide levels in the 400s, Butler and other climate scientists said. So another thing that we do pretty regularly around here in business, in the military, in science, is plotting trajectories. It's something that, frankly, scientists, business people, and military folks do every day. There's nothing new here. When you plot the trajectory for our carbon concentration, the trajectory for our carbon pollution predicts 688 parts per million in the year 2095 and 1,097 parts per million in the year 2195. 688 parts per million in the year 2095, when for 8,000 centuries it's been between 170 and 300. 8,000 centuries, 170 to 300, and by the end of this century, 688. To put that 800,000-year figure in perspective, mankind has engaged in agriculture for maybe 10,000 years, maybe a little more. 800,000 years ago, it's not clear we'd yet figured out how to make a fire. Millions of years ago, goes back into geologic time. And those carbon concentrations, 688 parts per million, 1,097 parts per million, those are carbon concentrations that we have not seen in millions of years on the surface of the Earth. And we're headed for them in just a century and a half, 2 centuries. As Tyndall determined at the time of the Civil War, increasing carbon concentrations will absorb more of the sun's heat and raise global temperatures, and experience around the world is proving that that is taking place in front of our faces in undeniable ways. We think often of climate change as happening to our atmosphere, and we think of its effects on our lands because we're land-based creatures. But let me talk just for a moment about our oceans. In April of this year, a group of scientific experts came together to discuss the current state of our oceans. Their workshop report stated this, and I'll quote, "Human actions have resulted in warming and acidification of the oceans and are now causing increased hypoxia." Hypoxia is when there's not enough oxygen trapped in the ocean to sustain life of creatures that live in the ocean. Studies of the Earth's past indicate that these are the 3 symptoms, warming, acidification, and increased hypoxia, are the 3 symptoms associated with each of the previous 5 mass extinctions on Earth. We experienced 2 mass ocean extinctions 55 million years ago and 251 million years ago. Last year, a paleobiologist at Brown University, whose name is Jessica Whiteside, published a study demonstrating that it took 8 million years after that earlier extension, the one 251 million years ago, it took 8 million years after that for plant and animal diversity to return to pre-extinction levels. So that was a pretty heavy-duty wipeout if it took 8 million years to recover. Here's the tough part. In the lead-up to these past mass ocean extinctions, scientists have estimated that the Earth was emitting carbon into the atmosphere at a rate of 2.2 gigatons per year for the earlier extinction, and somewhere between 1 and 2 gigatons per year for the second extinction over several thousand years. Now remember how much are we releasing now? 7 to 8 gigatons a year. 2.2 and somewhere between 1 and 2 were the levels that led to those mass extinctions in geologic time, and we're at now 7 to 8 gigatons a year. As the group of Oxford scientists noted, both of these estimates, the ones for how much was being released in those geologic times, are dwarfed in comparison to today's emissions. Our oceans are indeed changing before our very eyes, and anyone who spends time on the oceans or who studies the oceans knows this. The oceans are rising. The oceans are swept by more violent storms. The oceans are getting more acid, affecting already the creatures at the bottom of the food chain upon which ocean life depends. It is very hard for a creature to succeed in an environment in which it is becoming soluble. And that is what is happening as our oceans acidify and the small, basic creatures at the very bottom of the food chain that live by making their shells can no longer make shells successfully because the water is too acidic. In the Arctic, we see unprecedented ice melt. The caps are shrinking. Every day, it seems, we hear about a new record being broken, a new loss of ice cover in the Arctic. In the tropics, we see coral dying. In some places, 80% of the coral is gone. I've been to places that I can remember live and lively coral reefs, and now you go back and the coral's still there, but it's dead. It's like an abandoned building. Fish can swim around in it, but it's not the fountain of life that a coral reef is supposed to be. There is a garbage gyre in the Pacific that is estimated to be larger than the size of the state of Texas, in which enormous amounts of the plastics that we discard are being swept and floating. We have whales that are poisoned to the point where if they come ashore in Rhode Island on the summer day, if they're hurt or they get washed ashore because they're injured, we often end up with whale cadavers in the summers on our coast. When that happens, it's reasonably likely that that whale is toxic waste. That if you towed the body back out to the ocean to let it sink and let nature take its course, you'd be violating our clean water laws by disposing of toxic waste. If you cranked that whale's body up into the back of a truck and took it to the town dump and chucked it, you'd be violating the hazardous waste disposal laws of the state of Rhode Island, because we have put so much poison into the ocean that creatures like whales that live at the top of the food chain have now become so infiltrated with these poisons that they are now swimming toxic waste. Around here, we like to think pretty highly of ourselves. But the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, the laws of science, these are laws of nature. These are laws of God's earth. We can repeal some laws around here. We can't repeal those. Senators are used to our opinions mattering around here. These laws are not affected by our opinions. For these laws of nature, because we can neither repeal them nor influence them, we bear a duty of stewardship, of responsibility to future generations to see and respond to the facts that are before our faces. and to see and respond to those facts according to nature's laws. There is no lobbyist so powerful, there is no secret special interest so wealthy that it can change the operation of those laws. What they have done is to change the operation of our laws, inhibited our ability to meet our duty to respond to the laws of our God-given earth. We do indeed bear a duty to make the right decisions for our children and grandchildren and our God-given earth. And right now, we are failing, shamefully failing in that duty. We are deluded if we think that somehow we will be spared the plain and foreseeable consequences of our failure to act. Some may hope that they will find a wizard's hat and wand with which to wish all of this away. Well, that is not rational thinking. And if we have a simple obligation to our children and to future generations, it's to be rational human beings and to make rational decisions based on the evidence and the laws of nature. These laws of nature are known. Earth's message to us is clear. Our failure is blameworthy. Its consequences are profound, and the costs will be very, very high. I see the distinguished senator from Alaska, who actually brought a wonderful scientist from the University of Alaska who gave one of the better presentations on ocean acidification that I have ever seen as part of our Oceans Caucus. So I yield the floor to Senator Murkowski.
Mr. President.
The senator from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I've had an opportunity to listen to a few moments of the comments